and welcome to today's webinar on highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 and its impact on the pet food industry. I'm Jordan Tyler, Director of Media at BSM Partners and host of the Barking Mad podcast, and I look forward to leading a panel of experts today in this critical discussion. H5N1 avian influenza has become a growing concern, particularly its transmissions to mammals like dairy cows and domestic pets, as well as its looming threat to the security of American poultry supply chains and the markets that rely on them. For those of us in the pet food industry, the current outbreak raises urgent questions about food safety, supply chain disruptions, regulatory changes, and mitigation strategies. Today, 4 longtime pet food industry experts will break down the risks and share actionable steps that manufacturers can take to safeguard both their products and the pets they serve. We have Dr. Katie Miller, Director of Veterinary Services at BSM Partners, who brings 14 years of pet nutrition and retail experience to this webinar, as well as 7 years spent practicing emergency veterinary medicine. We also have Dr. Bradley Quest, Principal of Veterinary Services at BSM Partners. Dr. Quest has spent more than 2 decades in the pet food industry, and before that, ran his own veterinary practice for about 10 years. Also joining us is August Coney, Principal of BSM Assurance at BSM Partners. August offers more than 30 years of food safety, quality assurance, and regulatory expertise, particularly for pet foods and proteins. I'm also pleased to introduce Al Pantillo, the Co-Chief Executive Officer of Mud Bay, a leading pet specialty retailer in the Pacific Northwest. We already know that food safety is always top of mind in our industry, but recent media coverage and a couple high-profile recalls have heightened consumer concerns. To help us navigate these challenges, Al has graciously lent us his time to share some of the questions he's heard from pet parents, how retailers can balance transparency with reassurance, and industry-wide steps necessary to maintain consumer confidence during this outbreak. Tons of expertise here today as we look forward to sharing valuable insights for industry professionals about this increasingly important issue. So with that, let's get started. Al, let's start by having you tell our viewers a little bit about you.
Yeah, hi, my name's Al Pantillo, and I'm co-CEO at Mud Bay. We're a Pacific Northwest retailer with 64 stores in Oregon and Washington, and we've been around since 1988. We're family and friends and employee owned, still to this day, and our mission is to improve the lives of dogs and cats and the people who care for them. So that's kind of why we're here today for this really important topic.
Now, from a retail perspective, what kinds of questions have you heard from independent pet retail shoppers or even your store employees regarding H5N1 and pet food safety?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern, and it's warranted, right? It's gotten a lot of news coverage. I believe more news coverage than it warrants. But we all know that this is how the pet industry works, right? We've had folks coming in just wanting to validate the safety, of the foods they're buying. I think we're in the same boat as a lot of other independent retailers. They value our opinion, so they want a recommendation, and they want to know that, number one, we're experts and we're up to speed on what's going on, and number two, that we can wholeheartedly make a recommendation on what's going to be safe. I think the problem is sort of the gray area in getting to that. So this is what we are trying to do at Mud Bay, is do all those things, give them all the answers that they're looking for. But we are also really trying to intentionally give them our perspective on this and give them what the risk is, because there's pretty much nothing any of us sell in any of our stores that is completely risk-free. You are constantly weighing. I mean, that's true in our own lives. It's true in our pets' lives. You have to weigh, risk and reward. And where we really feel this shakes out right now is there some risk? Yes, but it's pretty small. And our manufacturers need to step up and address that small percentage of the risk. So getting that easy for me to say, having partners like BSM and, you know, our consultation with our staff veterinarian and our category managers and a bunch of years of experience to be able to say that. Being able to walk that fine line with a customer and explain to them exactly where we are now and where we're pushing our manufacturers to be in the very near future is a lot harder.
So, in a sense, you have to advocate for the pet and the pet owner, but you also have to advocate for the industry members that make your business successful. So, I can see how that would be a delicate balance.
It really is important. It's one of the reasons that indie pets, why Mudbay immediately reached out to BSM to get professional consultation on this. It's why the indie pet board of directors is like, hey, this is this type of thing that if we allow it to erode confidence in what we all feel is a great, great nutritional solution, pet owners lose, our channel loses. We all need to get ahead of this. We have the power and the understanding of this to make sure this doesn't turn into another DCM. There's really no reason for it to, but we know that things take on a life of their own in the pet industry. We have to be ahead of this.
Exactly. And there have been several really high profile recalls recently, so people are a little bit on edge. But really, it's a matter of banding together and providing that peace of mind. But also, like you said, stepping up and making sure that we're doing the right things from an industry level as well.
Yeah, and I think the second wave of this, it's got the initial news media cycle. What we all need to be prepared for is the second wave of this when it actually starts being spoken about and asked about by veterinarians, right? We have seen the veterinary community be very skeptical of raw foods to begin with, and this is going to fuel that if we do not have all the protocols in place, the testing to say we're addressing it. It's not enough just for us to say, hey, this was only a couple of incidents. We don't think this is a big deal. We have to have it all buttoned up so that when that next wave comes, we can say, no, we have these kill steps in place. We have this testing process. We have this test and hold, uniformly for all of our brands. Mudbay did not go as far as to require that with brands right now to give them time to do the work, actually update their processes, not put out a false claim on what they're doing. But in the very near future, we will, and I don't think we're alone in that. I think retailers need to be taking that next proactive step of requiring that these things be in place for manufacturers.
Let's move on now to some of the questions and sentiments you've heard from industry members.
Yeah, it's been all over the board, right? So initially it was just trying to wrap their arms around, okay, do we really have a responsibility to test for this? Is this something just kind of fluky? Because you've seen the transmission of this, particularly in the dairy industry. It's actually coming from dairy workers and being introduced into the food chain. It's not actually coming from the product. And so there's all this question, is it product based? Is it process and human interaction with the process based? And we've really just been trying to say that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where it's coming from. Doesn't matter if it's only introduced to a couple products versus an entire supply chain issue. We need to be testing, right at the beginning. We need to be testing at the end. We need to be looking at all the steps in between. Just like any other pathogen, don't treat this as something different or as a unique case that only happens once in a while. It's a pathogen. It's out there. We've been testing for pathogens of all types in pet food processing for a long time. There's a zero tolerance, for this by the FDA in particularly things that do not have a secondary kill step. Just make it part of the process. And then we've gotten questions like, well, I don't even know if I can. I don't know if testing's available. I'm not sure where the PCR test is. We're like, no, it's commercially available. We have very small raw manufacturers who are already doing this. We're quick to do this. They already have it in place. And so it's just a matter of, I think, all getting to the base facts of what's really the best practice here and making sure everybody adopts it.
Absolutely. And there is an interesting nuance with raw pet foods and the question of pathogens, but the industry has been testing for pathogens since forever, right? But that said, when one recall happens or one product comes under scrutiny, it puts the entire raw category at risk.
Yeah, it's about protecting that whole concept, and also the nutritional evidence is out there. All of us who feed raw see it in our pets that there is improved health benefit even above gently cooked, which has a kill step. And the easiest thing in this whole situation to have happen is for stores or for manufacturers to go, you know what, this isn't worth it. I'm just going to switch to something that has a kill step, right? That actually is, one step down in the unprocessed protein food chain that, we all feel offers a bunch of benefit, and just kind of forfeit this category that's unique to our channel, has a bunch of health benefit just for sake of not being able to well articulate or to prove the process is in place to keep it safe. That's what we're all trying to prevent.
So, if you had a message for, let's say, raw pet food manufacturers specifically during this outbreak, what would that be?
I think they need to move to pre and post testing, incoming source of meats and outbound, and get that communication out as soon as possible, along with their test and hold standards. I think, pretty much everybody is test and hold, but a good reminder, that, hey, here's what we have in place. That needs to be in place as soon as possible. And I say that because not only because I think we're going to require it and other people are going to be asking for that in the near future, but also we have seen, not to be alarmist, but we have seen the FDA be punitive in these situations in the past. And if they're sniffing something that they think can get publicity, do the public good, there's a lot of different motivating factors there. I fear that they may look to make an example of a raw manufacturer or two, and that's not good for anybody. That's not good for the manufacturers, obviously, or any of the rest of us. So let's all err on the side of the caution and get this all ticked and tied right now before we're all scrambling.
And what advice would you give to your fellow independent pet retailers to help them weather this storm?
Education, 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 with your staff. And then, and we can, we're, we are trying to ramp up as well. It's not like we're doing this perfectly either. But education, not only to your staff, but then all the way through to the customer, right? So what else can you do to drive confidence, at the shelf, on your freezer doors, on your website? We're working on, we've always had Mudbay certified in Mudbay, which captures and is our way of validating how you test your product, how you source your product, all the things that we feel are required from a manufacturer to be a great manufacturer. And those have always been in the back end, sort of hidden from the customer. It's just what we do to validate before we bring a product in, and then we do regularly. We're looking at bringing some of those to the forefront. So we're getting really in-depth questions at the store level. Our staff understands what HPP is. Our staff understands, what bacteriophages are. They understand how to have these conversations. They just need the information to be able to say, yeah, specifically, here is what this manufacturer is doing. And so we're trying to create those pathways to our staff members and all the way to the customer. So if the customer wants to go on our site and they're looking at this individual product, we're looking at standing that information up, at the product level or someplace else, whether it be in a blog post or something else where they can get their hands on that and build confidence. So I'd encourage everybody to do that. I think IndiePet is going to help organize some of that information as we develop things or other IndiePet members develop things. IndiePet is a gathering place for these things, and this is something that we gladly share. Mudbay had our initial response that we made customer facing and we educated our staff on. We made that public. It's on the IndiePet site if people want to go and look at it. And as other retailers do a great job of this, we're going to keep sharing that. So just keep pushing the information out.
A great message. And thank you, Al, for sharing. So, in a nutshell, the industry has to work toward balancing transparency and consumer trust by taking proactive steps to minimize the risk of H5N1. Additionally, education is crucial at all levels. from manufacturers to retailers, to ensure informed decision making, prevent unnecessary panic, and keep the independent pet retail sector strong. So, now that we've explored some of the concerns and responsibilities within the pet food industry, let's take a step back and cover what we know about this virus. Dr. Miller, could you please give us a high-level overview of what H5N1 avian influenza is, how it spreads, and why this current outbreak we're experiencing is so concerning for both the pet food industry and for public health?
So this virus spreads among waterfowl and poultry birds primarily, but it can infect mammals. It also has recently started to infect cows. It can infect cats, which is one of the primary reasons this is a concern for the pet food industry. And it can also potentially infect humans through direct contact with infected birds, environmental contamination, so through personnel. So high-risk personnel would be people that work in the poultry industry. Dairy workers are at the highest risk right now, we believe, and then potentially veterinarians. So one of the key characteristics of this virus is that it is highly pathogenic, which means it's very effective at mortality. So it kills about 100% of birds within 48 hours of infection. Luckily, this isn't a mammal disease, so it doesn't want to live in mammals and reproduce. That's not their typical host. So it is not as pathogenic in most mammals, but we are seeing that cats are particularly susceptible to this virus, and it is particularly dangerous if they get it. The first detection in U.S. dairy cows was just here in 2004, last year, and we're seeing it expand into more mammalian infections. Especially impactful for our industry is that we're seeing infection in cats and dogs. But their highest risk is actually coming into contact in the environment or with wild birds, or if they're hunting dogs or they're hunting these waterfowl or birds, that's where they're at highest risk. But there is a risk and a potential for it if it enters the food chain through eggs, milk, or poultry products.
Thank you for that important context. August, coming to you next, could you please give us a little bit more color on the risk of cross-contamination in pet food production specifically? We know pet food diets rely heavily on poultry proteins and ingredients. So, what steps would you recommend manufacturers take to mitigate the risk of this outbreak?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jordan. So you're exactly right. There is a lot of ingredients involved with pet foods, not only in direct protein addition. Chicken is one of the most popular flavors for all pet foods, whether dogs and cats out there, as well as different types of ingredients that would have a avian base, such as egg products or a dried egg powder that go into as raw materials, ingredients into pet food. The risks are exactly that. The risks are either in the raw material sourcing itself and coming in with raw materials, but let's not also forget that there is a risk of cross-contamination. A lot of these pet food manufacturers are set in rural areas where the employees themselves would have contact with either different farm flocks, if they're working near or around poultry farms, or they could be in livestock too, as we know that Dr. K just said that there's transfer to some of that mammalian species as well. So doing the due diligence to understand what their risks are. I know we'll go into this in more detail a little later, but that is key, that risk assessment to their different, the sources of risk, that either be employees or raw materials, and understanding what they need to do to make sure they mitigate those risks.
Throughout this discussion, we'll get much more specific about how manufacturers can mitigate this risk, but thank you, August, for those high-level takeaways. Moving on to the impact of H5N1 on the poultry supply chain, Dr. Quest, could you please speak to the risk of raw material shortages? And what practical strategies can manufacturers use to help minimize disruptions along their supply chains?
That's what a lot of people are super interested in anytime we have any kind of an animal, an agriculture animal issue or even a crop issue that we know is going to affect the supply chain. And, you know, building on what Dr. Katie said, H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza, has a really high mortality rate, meaning it pretty much kills all the birds that it infects. And the only way that the poultry industry can try to keep this under control is to try to stop the spread as much as possible. And the only way to do that is through depopulation. Unfortunately, with widespread depopulation, we definitely affect the supply chain, meaning there's obviously going to be less poultry products. Initially, it's going to affect eggs, potentially even affect some of the skeletal poultry meats as well. Um, and it's really important, not just for this, but really for everything for manufacturers and co-manufacturers to have contingency plans for things like this because I know we've talked about it before and we've written about it, H5N1 or avian influenza in general. It's not a new disease. It's been around a long time. It ebbs and flows. It's not just a U.S. problem. It's, affecting a lot of different regions of the world. And so we have to keep in mind when these things are going to happen, what is our contingency plan going to be for a specific category of ingredients like egg products?
Yeah, a lot of the U.S. supply for egg products or dried egg powder for that matter comes from what we call the breakers of shelled eggs. So they rely on the supply of table eggs in order to create, which is kind of like their natural byproduct of the dried egg powder and the different egg products. When you decrease the population or you depopulate those egg-laying hens for table eggs, not meat production, but for table eggs, this obviously is going to affect the availability of those kinds of products as well. So this becomes, very instrumental in understanding where you're sourcing, your typical poultry supply. So if you're working through like a broker for your poultry supply, whether that be meat products, or, like I said, egg products, that you understand where those are coming from so that you don't run into potential risks for export issues. And likewise, understanding if you're bringing meat into the country, that they're not from sources that are going to have bans or restrictions as well.
It sounds like there needs to be accountability and cooperation all across the supply chain to ensure raw materials are safe and secure. So, Dr. Quest, this is something I've heard you speak about many times. This is not just a supplier issue or an issue at the raw ingredient level. It's the entire industry's issue. So, would you care to elaborate on the importance of shared responsibility before we move on to more specifics?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Jordan. This is really everybody's issue, whether it's in the food, human food supply chain or the pet food supply chain as well. And it goes right down to, the manufacturer and the brand levels, and I know we'll talk about it a little bit more, but we've got so many different product formats out there in the market. But really, to me, the take home message is however you're making pet food, you better make sure that you're doing everything you can to mitigate the risk, not just H5N1, but any other kind of foodborne pathogens out there. And you need to work with your ingredient suppliers, but that the answer isn't just putting all the onus on the ingredient suppliers. It really falls onto the brands themselves because at the end of the day, you're selling the product that the consumer's buying and you're going to be held accountable, for that.
Thank you for that. So, speaking of contamination mitigation, let's move now to specific measures pet food manufacturers can implement to make sure what's coming into their plants isn't conducive to the spread of H5N1. August, let's hear your tips for effective sanitation and cleaning protocols that you'd encourage manufacturers to employ.
Yeah, so obviously this is where I have a lot of experience in these types of concerns in different food plants. I can't emphasize enough. The one thing is that understanding your traceability and your lot tracking of raw material supply. That's key. It's part of the requirements for any kind of FDA food safety program or even USDA food safety program that you got to maintain good traceability records. Some people use electronics, some things are all in bad sheets. Any process that works to control your traceability is still, very applicable here. And the reason why I bring that up is it's important to know how you make a clean break. So often when we see these recalls start out at one level of concern and then they expand to a much greater level of concern with more product being recalled as the recall is happening, it's because they did not establish a clean break in their process. Clean breaks is based off of when they have good solid sanitation and when that has been tested to be free of the organisms of concern. So here's a few tricks, or here's a good things to know about H5N1. All of our common industrial cleaning sanitizers, cleaning compounds and sanitizers are effective at inactivating H5N1. So that means any of your quaternary ammonium compounds, any of your acids that we use, any of your bleach or chlorine that we use, for a lot of things. So all these types of disinfectants are also very effective against H5N1. Making sure that you're cleaning at the right frequency. So if you know that you have a increased risk of running poultry products, you might want to stop and do a thorough cleaning in between running a chicken-based formula and moving on to a beef-based formula, for instance, or a fish-based formula. So making sure that you take the time to put those stopgap measures in there would be very helpful. And then understanding, identifying, and testing your environmental swabs correctly. So you need to have a large enough sampling size that you would be able to detect any kind of pathogens, including H5N1, and then be able to appropriately deal with it, in a timely fashion. So understanding and having good environmental testing programs. Too often I see out there, kind of a hodgepodge of how much do I sample, where do I sample? Obviously, focus on food contact equipment too, but don't forget about those ancillary areas where employees can come in contact with ancillary areas and then bring it back to a food contact area. So all areas need to be monitored, and a thorough risk assessment and the frequency of that becomes very important.
Right. And each plant is different, each process is different. And so it really does depend on what you're making, how you're making it, what ingredients you're handling, and so on. Dr. Quest, I was wondering if you could speak a little on how certain processing technologies like heat treatments or other mitigations can help reduce the risk of H5N1 in pet food products themselves.
Yeah, sure. We mentioned it earlier, the pet food landscape in the US and really globally is so diverse. We've got all different kinds of products out there. And, our job isn't to talk about, the pros or the cons of one product format over another, but what we want to do is share with folks, what we know are good practices to help, mitigate any pathogens, including H5N1 and, things we definitively know. Extrusion cooking, making kibble definitively inactivates the virus. Retort cooking, canned trays, pouches, those types of products definitively inactivates the virus. Baking processes definitively inactivates the virus, and not just H5N1, but most of the other, um, primary pathogens that we're looking for. I'll just mention a little bit, there's always some spore formers like Clostridium and things like that, may be a little bit outside of the norm, but for the most part, all these processes that heat the product to a minimum of 165 degrees. In some cases, you can get away with a little less, but we like to use 165 degrees Fahrenheit. You're going to be fine. But we also understand that there are products in the market that don't use those kinds of temperature processing conditions. So there are things that use high pressures. A lot of us are familiar with processes called HPP or high pressure pasteurizations. Those processes can inactivate all of the pathogens that we talked about, including H5N1. Sometimes They can actually be combined with acidification, changes within the formulation. A lot of times an acidic product will help also mitigate pathogen growth, whether it's bacterial or viral viability, and then bacterial growth, because the viruses don't actually grow in the pet food. They have to have a live host. But I think it's important to remember that sometimes there are combinations of doing a lot of things, especially if we're using an alternative format, something other than extrusion, retort, or baking. Um, Radiation, and I know August has done a lot of extensive research on it. But radiation, if it's the right dosage or the right amount and at the right time, can also help inactivate pathogens such as H5N1 as well. A lot of it is just about design and flow in the plant, making sure that, your workers that have handled raw ingredients don't come in contact with finished product. You have specific designated areas for, incoming raw material, the process that actually makes the material, and then where the finished product goes. And you don't have overlap, and you don't have people going back and forth. And that's really with anything. It doesn't matter whether you're making kibble or raw pet food or whatever. That's just basic, um, you know, a good part of a good food safety plan. And then I think something else that's really important for folks to keep in mind is the FDA just recently came out and said that H5N1 is now a required identifiable risk that pet food manufacturers have to account for, meaning that you have to have mention of that and how you are mitigating that risk in your food safety plan. In a lot of cases, it may not just be one thing that pet food manufacturers and co-manufacturers need to be doing, but combinations of things to help mitigate the risk. And yeah, that's part of what we do. We like to help people with those processes, whether it's sourcing ingredients, whether it's looking at their process. August and his team looking at their whole food safety plan. I think you really have to keep those front and center.
Coming back to something Dr. Miller mentioned earlier, one of the ways this virus spreads is through people who come in contact with infected animals. So, poultry rearing and manufacturing and pet food manufacturing are all kind of high risk professions right now. And while the virus doesn't want to live in mammals, humans can be a key vector for how this virus spreads by being carriers for it. So, August, what advice do you have for manufacturers to help support their employees and make sure that they understand their role in protecting themselves, the products, and pets from H5N1?
Yeah, this is one of my most favorite topics to talk about, actually, because one of the things that I love to do is I love to talk to people about a food safety culture and what it means to be part of a food safety culture. There's a reason why there's thousands of jobs in these food industries and meat industries, and everyone has a part to play. So understanding the importance of cross-contamination and how things from the home can bring cross-contamination to the plant. That's not just pathogens, that could be like bugs, insects. That could be where you store your gear at the end of the day. Like, do you just throw it in the garage or you take it in the house where it's more protected? Do you have other exposure to other animals, such as backyard chickens, or other, do you live in a rural area on a farm? What's your risk if you work on a farm and come to a meat plant? When you work in agriculture, you work in agriculture. It's something you enjoy doing. It's something that you usually love. But on the flip side of that, they got to understand that this is the food we all eat. So you're putting your own family at risk if you don't do your best to come in clean, come in with clean apparel, follow the GMPs, follow the sanitation practices as the plan is set forth, be in your areas of work and not deviate and wander throughout the plant. If you're not doing those things, you're literally putting your families at risk.
Moving now to the regulatory landscape. So, August, if you could kind of pull back the curtain on some of the regulatory changes that are happening on a federal level in response to H5N1. So, in January, the FDA announced they would require pet food manufacturers to work the risk of H5N1 into their existing food safety plans. So, how can companies prepare themselves for this increased level of regulatory scrutiny?
Well, when the FDA makes a change like that and they require this, first of all, they gave everyone 90 days to reassess their food safety plans. Okay, the one thing that I would expect is I would expect USDA to follow suit. I wouldn't be surprised if you see an additional notice from the USDA mandating the same thing, that everyone's food safety plans are reassessed for that. Um, it's key, to what Dr. Katie was talking about earlier is like, since the transfer of this disease is mostly through wild birds, it obviously is near impossible to control. So the control will have to be in the mitigations that we put in the plant. So one of the things that I would expect to see, especially probably starting from USDA first, is that they're going to do some sampling and testing of those poultry providers to make sure that that H5N1 is not present in the actual meat products that they're producing. And keep in mind, this is the feeder channels for all pet food ingredients. But your egg products, your shelled eggs, all those kind of things, you're going to see increased sampling from the USDA specifically for H5N1. So any of those kind of suppliers, I would imagine that there is going to be a testing plan developed and some kind of monitoring frequency that the USDA will be employing on that. From the FDA side of that, and the USDA side too, one thing that you'll see is all third-party audit systems will change to include, this kind of risk assessment out there. So because the FDA, has made a mandate that this happens, this is going to change all the audits in which you're doing to make sure that they include that as a specific point of reference. On the testing, I would imagine there's going to be twofold that they're going to challenge your risk assessment. One is on your incoming materials and how you're testing or screening your incoming materials for H5N1 as part of your, development plan. And then two is like, how are you testing or ensuring finished goods coming out of your facility have also been screened against H5N1. So this will drive increased testing within the industry on both the USDA side of things and the FDA side of things, to put more identification to this risk, considering that even though it's a low probability of transfer and spread, it is happening. And there's evidence to that in the news.
So we can expect to see increased testing protocols. Dr. Miller, I know that you've been staying very close to this particular development. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the current testing landscape, what that looks like, and how manufacturers can identify where they're able to get their products tested for H5N1.
Unfortunately, this is not a very robust system yet. We will see rapidly a turnaround in this, I believe, with the new food safety qualification steps that they need to take, and more people asking for it. The more people that ask for it, the more money there is in it, and that these testing companies will start facilitating that process for us. And if anybody has any questions and needs a reference lab, they can definitely reach out to us, because we do have some sources available right now.
So this increased regulatory scrutiny and the testing that will result from it will also have an economic impact on pet food manufacturers. So, Dr. Quest, what kinds of financial implications do you think are most salient when it comes to this compliance? And how would you suggest manufacturers manage these costs without sacrificing quality or speed to market or anything else?
Well, I would actually say that everything that we're talking about will actually help improve the quality. So it would be that would definitely be a positive. And then, when you think about it, anytime you start doing something different, at least up front, there's usually going to be some kind of cost associated with that. But what you're doing is you're actually investing in your brand in the case of the manufacturers, and then, for the co-manufacturers and the plants themselves, you're investing in their overall food safety plan as well, because it's really hard to put a price on what a recall costs a pet food brand, but a robust food safety plan is always going to pay dividends, and it's always going to make it's going to make your brand most likely to be able to continue to sell product even in the face of an outbreak like this. And if you're not if you're not doing everything you can to mitigate that risk, then you are at risk for being one of those brands that potentially gets a recall.
I like that message. Brands that are doing their due diligence and really making the upfront investment to ensure they're mitigating this risk are going to have the best chance of keeping their products, their brand, their customers, and pets safe. But I also wanted to talk briefly about the impact on innovation. So, Dr. Miller, as we're thinking about adapting to this challenge of H5N1, what kinds of emerging solutions could the industry be looking toward that show promise for mitigating cross-contamination or pathogen risks going forward?
One thing to look at would be alternative protein sources. So insect-based protein sources are very, as far as food safety goes, they're very safe. Alternative proteins. You have plant-based protein sources, which of course wouldn't have the same risk. So there's new and exciting alternative proteins that are in the pipeline that are getting new ingredient approval, hopefully in the next year or two, and cultured protein being one of them, that will be an interesting prospect, and the ability to mitigate this risk of viral infection and some of the bacterial infections, that they're just going to be at lower risk because they're not an animal source protein.
Yeah, I think it's always good. We talked a little bit about, risk mitigation. And so, August did a good job of talking about how, any egg product's probably going to be the most affected here, at least initially. And so, if for some reason, egg product doesn't become available, you better have a plan in place. But you have to be agile enough, I think, in your brand philosophy that sometimes you may have to pivot and go to something else. It doesn't mean that you're going to negatively make a less nutritious or safe product, but sometimes you just have to you have to be able to have that kind of flexibility, I think, when it comes to this. Because, today it's, potentially egg product, who knows, tomorrow it could be, beef ingredients. You just don't know.
The last thing I'd like to cover before we move into some questions is how pet food manufacturers can clearly communicate the steps they're taking to prevent H5N1 to their end consumers. So, Dr. Miller, I know you do a ton of work helping brands and retailers communicate with their customers. So, would you like to share any strategies or tips that brands can use to maintain transparency and bolster trust with retailers and pet parents during this outbreak?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. So I think that you've got to really develop trust through clear communication and about your safety protocols. So there was a study done in about 2023 on the purchasing of food for people and what their buying trends were. And there was a major shift from things like taste, price, and convenience. And they switched to transparency, supply chain visibility, food safety, and health and well-being. And I think that we see the same trends show up in pet food that we do human food. And so I think that this is an extremely important topic to talk about. Pet parents still have a negative perception of pet food. In some cases, they're very skeptical that we're doing something behind the curtain or we're not speaking the truth. And the one way to mitigate that is with as much transparency as possible through every step of food production that you can, and the steps that you're taking to ensure that a safe product is being delivered to them. Some of the practices for transparency with retailers and customers would be to be transparent about your food safety certifications. There's no reason that you can't let them know what your food certifications are, or even allow them to. You may not want a brand to put the name of the manufacturing plant on their website, but they should be able to. You should allow them to put your food safety certifications on there. This isn't necessarily an H5N1 specific. This is for all food safety, no matter what type of food that you're producing or what type of risk your product has. That all food manufacturers should be transparent in this aspect. If you're talking to a retailer about your food safety plan, explain your practices, and especially if you're using novel or innovative practices, explain them to the best of your ability, and to share anything, if you have like any published studies that you can show that documentation that demonstrates the efficacy of the process that you're using. Share negative test results and food certification scores. It's not enough anymore to just say that foods are not sourced from China. Consumers and retailers are demanding more than just where the product is sourced from. Be able to show the making of the food from farm to bowl, explain what steps are going into it to make that food safe. And then this can be an overwhelming amount of information. So, and that is very specialized. So it may take hiring a consultant that can help write that for you and write that messaging to make it simple and easy for a customer or a retailer to understand, and not make it so overwhelming.
Thank you for that. Let's take a minute here now to answer a couple questions that we received. So this first one is for you, Dr. Quest. How can manufacturers address consumer concerns about raw diets without losing market share?
Yeah, I think that's a question that we actually get a lot, Jordan, from, a lot of our clients and even others in the industry. You know, I think first thing we need to understand that, not all, and I'm using air quotes, raw products are the same. There are products that are truly raw. There are raw products that undergo some of the processing steps we talked about earlier, like high pressure, radiation, acidification, things like that. Um, so what's really important, and just it's going to build on what Katie said and what August said, is to have that good message about this is what your product is. This is what your process is. These are all the things that you do to mitigate risk, not just with H5N1, but with all pathogens and really for food safety in general. And we have had a lot of clients, who historically have asked us to help them with the process, but two, with the messaging to their, consumer base and the pet parents that buy their product. Because if you're not doing that, and, Katie, talked a lot about transparency. If you're not doing that, you kind of look like you got something to hide. Like you're not being, completely forthright about what it is that you're doing. So having that good message, first of all, being able to confidently know that you're doing everything you can to mitigate risk, and then communicating that in a way that your consumers are going to understand it and trust you and your products.
And just one more question, this one for you, August. We talked at length about how we can minimize supply chain disruptions and the key opportunities there. But the question is, what are some actionable steps to minimize supply chain disruptions? So would you mind rehashing some of the important points that we talked about today?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple different things that a plant or a brand can do to help, minimize the disruption, of some kind of supply chain event. One is to have multiple sources. So not only do you want to have multiple suppliers, you want to have multiple suppliers in different geographical areas. This will go a long way, towards helping, and even if some of that is external to the US and some of it is internal to the US, but different geographical locations will become important. Next, I would sit there and say, be agile, have alternative ingredient sources. So if you're looking for an ingredient that provides protein to a product, that you have multiple ones that you can switch to and have tested out, already have it in the bank. Like, here's the one that's the least cost to us, but if the prices skyrocket, we're going to move to this protein source. And we know it's a little bit more expensive, but it'll be less expensive if the prices skyrocket, and then therefore we'll be able to weather it much better. So that's another mitigation technique that you can do. And then also is be as demanding of your other suppliers as, your consumers are demanding of you. So make sure that you do the due diligence to vet them in an appropriate way and make sure you understand what their food safety processes are. Require COAs if it's something critical to your operation, which is certificate of analysis, which means they've done the testing at the raw material source instead of you getting it and having to test and then finding out it's bad and then not being able to work through it because maybe you're doing just-in-time delivery or something like that. So, you don't want to sit there and get in that trap. So make sure that it's clean coming in. There's another mitigation step, so kind of get ahead of it. And those, I think those are the big three things that brands can do to help with that global supply source.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Now, before we close out today's discussion, I'd like to go around and get everybody's key takeaway. So, Dr. Katie Miller, if there is one thing you'd like a pet food manufacturer to know after tuning in today, what would that be?
Be loud and proud and transparent with your food safety practices. So consumers and retailers want and deserve to know what steps you've taken to keep food production safe. Share as much information as possible. If you don't want to share your manufacturing name or location, there's still no secret giveaways when you're sharing what your third-party certifications are, what their scores are, or what steps you're taking to mitigate risk to food and keeping food safe.
Dr. Quest, what would be your key takeaway from today?
Well, we talked a little bit about it, Jordan, but I think this is a topic where you can't have, people pointing fingers, and where pet food brands or manufacturers pointing to the, suppliers of the poultry ingredients or the egg ingredients or vice versa. It's really everybody's problem, and everybody needs to address it. And I know you mentioned a little bit specifically about some of the raw brands, and we talked a little bit about, but BSM, we're actually a very research driven organization. We do what we call branded research, where we do, set up feeding studies for different clients to help test their products, whether it's product substantiation claims or AFCO feeding studies, or you name it. But then we also do a lot of independent research too, and a lot of that's actually supported and funded by the industry. And I think if you're a brand and you're, making pet food, and we'll call it an alternative process other than the typical extrusion, retort, baking type processes, and you're not confident that there's existing research out there that your process will mitigate these pathogens, then you need to be supporting the research to do studies to show that your process does. And if there's not research there to support what you're doing, you need to be one of those companies that steps up and helps support that research.
And August, what would you like our viewers today to walk away from this webinar knowing?
First is that, your brand's on the label, your name's on the label, so that ultimate final accountability ends with you. There is no pointing fingers. There is no anything like that. So understanding that it's important, whether you're the actual direct manufacturer or that you're getting that co-manufactured through somebody else, that they know their worst day. What does your worst food safety day look like? And understanding and building, completing competent risk assessments around that event and putting in mitigations, food safety mitigations that will prevent that, or eliminate that event is the key. Is the key to me. So, and it's important that, like I said, you're not looking at your everyday run. What's the worst day? When the power goes out for 6 hours and the cooler broke and the temperature's not holding, and things like that. Understanding your worst day, and if you plan for your worst day, you'll always have a best day.
As we wrap up today's discussion, it's clear that H5N1 poses both challenges and opportunities for industry professionals. Whether it's diversifying your supply chains, being in closer dialogue with your suppliers and consumers, or reinforcing your commitment to food safety, transparency, and innovation, we hope you'll take today's learnings into practice. Remember, risk mitigation is a shared responsibility across the entire value chain. Manufacturers must take proactive steps to ensure safe ingredient testing, rigorous sanitation protocols, transparent testing, and clear communication with consumers. Additionally, with regulatory oversight ramping up around H5N1, preparedness will be key to staying compliant. And finally, this is a moment to embrace innovation, whether through alternative proteins, advanced safety technologies, or strategic supply chain diversification. At the end of the day, manufacturers that invest in food safety and commit to transparency will not only protect pets and consumers, but also build stronger trust and relationships for their brands. Thank you again to our expert panel for sharing their insights today, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. If you have remaining questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to media@bsmpartners.net. Together, we can stay informed, stay prepared, and keep our industry safe, secure, and resilient.